Today, we are very grateful to have David Chapman with us as a special guest. David is a historian who has written numerous works about sports, is an analyst of U.S. politics and its history, and has been featured in news articles from outlets such as townhall.com. David, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Great. So let's jump right in. I want to highlight your expertise in history today because many of us, including myself, don't truly understand the historic parallels to this election. They're difficult to comprehend. So would you mind elaborating a bit on this election compared to previous ones, what you see that you think was good, bad, ugly, etc.? Just your general thoughts on this 2020 election compared to previous ones.
Well, it's an unprecedented election. So the first thing that I was talking about even before the election was I was looking at Ohio and Florida, and that you don't lose an election when you win those states. And it looked like those states were going to go for Trump. And barring any shenanigans, Trump was going to win the election. I think Trump goaded the media yesterday into talking about the 1960 election, and which was hilarious. And that's the example where Nixon won Florida and Ohio and lost the election. That was a stolen election. But that's only one of like 27 examples. Since 1852, there's been 27 candidates that have won Ohio and Florida. 26 of them went on to win the election. The only one that didn't was Nixon, who lost. Mayor Daley in Chicago held back the vote until he knew how many he had to steal. So in terms of the historical, that was the way I was thinking before the election. After the election, I immediately realized, yeah, there's something wrong here. So historically, the election in terms of on president levels, there's a couple different elections you can compare to because there's different levels of this election. So you have the 1824 election that was stolen. The 1876 election is highly controversial. That was also another House election. The 1876 election, you can compare the remedy. So like one of the remedies that the Trump campaign is seeking right now is state legislators. In the 1876 election, they actually used state legislators to force a House remedy. So after the first initial vote, Tilden had 184 electoral votes, and you needed 185. And Hayes had 165. There was 20 electoral votes outstanding. So, and there was 4 states, and 3 of them, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, sent 2 sets of electors, forcing a contestation in the House of Representatives. And there's what was known as the Compromise of 1877, which basically said that Tilden would step aside and allow Hayes to become president so long as the Union Army is withdrawn from the southern states, because at the time it was Reconstruction and they were still occupying the South. But in terms of how that relates to today, it's the legislators, and that they have we have used the legislators before, and it was that's the remedy, that one of the remedies. And then the 2000 election, the legal remedies, of course, Bush v. Gore. So
Yeah,
I
I wanted to hop in there and I think that's an important point to make, that the legislators that idea of state legislators being used. It's been done before. It's not like it's unprecedented. Obviously, it's rare, but I think that was exactly what the founding fathers meant for it to be, was to be a rare instance or occurrence when there, in fact, was an undermining of election integrity. And I think that this casting by the media and by certain very far left outlets as of using this as undermining democracy. Well, for one, we're not a democracy. I think that's important for people to realize. I'm sure you understand that as somebody.
Yeah, if people don't understand the difference between a republic and a democracy, But we are a republic. People think of democracy as people who have a say and get to vote. That's not what a democracy is. Democracy is, majority rule. So
Exactly. And these safeguards, these constitutional safeguards, were made so that we would be a republic and that we could ensure that things were safe. And so, again, I think it was an absolutely shrewd and brilliant decision by the founding fathers to include. And this is the exact scenario I could imagine it being used in. So that's critical to note. I also want to go back to your point about the Trump tweet from Florida and Ohio, how he sent that out. Pretty adeptly done by the president, because he purposely brought up. Now, obviously, Trump knows that Florida and Ohio had been won before by a president. He absolutely looked it up, or someone told him, or he
well,
saw some tweet about it. There's no way he thought he was the only president to ever win Florida and Ohio.
and lose the election, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, everyone knows that. Everyone who knows anything about politics knows that Nixon won Florida and Ohio and lost the election. In fact, Nixon also won Iowa too. Won all three of those states massively, just like Trump did. Um, yeah, Trump definitely said something that was definitive, and easily fact checked. And once they went to fact check it, they found the only one out there that had ever happened was the 1960 election, which happened to be a notoriously stolen election. So it was certainly bait to get them to compare the 1960 election to the 2020 election, and
So,
it was a good move for him.
when you say that the 1960 election was stolen, right? Give our viewers here a little bit of background about how it was that election was rigged, because I think that's another critical point that people don't realize was how 1960 went about. There are some parallels there too to the 2020 election, not just in terms of what happened with Florida and Ohio being won, but the way in which JFK's team and the Democratic machine carried out that election.
Yeah, it's very similar. Just like the night of the election, everyone stopped counting recently, and then just they held back the vote, and then just dumped early in the morning. Mayor Daley in Chicago, the Chicago machine there, did the same thing. They held back the vote as long as they could, and then they stole as many votes as they had. Another one that is forgotten is that they also stole Texas from Nixon. Texas was a swing state at that time. So they stole Texas and Illinois. And that would have had Nixon carried those states, which if theoretically Nixon did, that would have put him at 270 electoral votes, one more than the 269 needed to win. Because at that time you only needed 269. So, in terms of the parallels, there's one interesting point I'd like to make. In the 1960 election, it was almost solely based on the idea that if you were a Catholic, you were voting JFK. If you were a Protestant, you were voting Nixon. It was divided right down religious lines. In the 2020 election, it was divided purely down class lines. If you were working class, you were voting for Donald Trump. If you're professional class, you were voting for Joe Biden. So there's another parallel there in that stark worldviews defined the election.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great points. Sorry for playing a little bit of speaking tag there for a moment, but no, I think it's again critical to note that the methods that were used with holding back the vote in cities and in urban areas and then dumping them very late in numbers that didn't make any sense is striking, because it's exactly what was done, or seems to appear to have been done this time around. And people went to jail for that, David, right? People went to jail over the 1960 election.
Well, I mean, over time, I don't know if they went to jail for the 1960 election, but over time there were several people indicted and jailed throughout the Mayor Daley's administration. He had several. I mean, he was corrupt in Chicago. I mean, they were not foreign to corruption charges in Chicago, and many of those charges were for election rigging. And the holding back the vote, that is just a an age old trick that has been used for hundreds 100 years for the Democrats. It is not something new. I think Robert Barnes told his audience that if you see the big cities holding back the vote late in the night, sell your bets because something bad's going to happen. So yeah, it's just standard operating procedure for those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And to piggyback off that, not only in the United States, but if you look at countries that have historically done activities like that, right? If you look globally, I don't want to harp on it too much, but Venezuela has many parallels in the way they conduct their elections to this 2020 election. You see the stopping of the vote. You see huge turnout in areas that shouldn't have turned out in ridiculous proportions for certain candidates. In fact, actually, moving on from Venezuela, just a brief talk about Ukraine. In 2004, the United States government released a report about why they believed that
Yeah,
the election was corrupt. David, I think you've tweeted about this as well. And we hit nearly every single marker that we wrote about for what a rigged election looked like in Ukraine. That included um, ballot drop off zones being abused, massive vote by mail, election laws being changed, massive turnout in certain urban areas. They called it North Korea style turnout. Again, there's a lot of parallels that our own government wrote about foreign countries. And yet in our own nation, it seems that we turn that blind eye because we don't believe that it could occur.
yeah, and the BBC also wrote about this in 2017 about African elections. And they're all the same standards. All the state departments of Western countries look for the same things. Abnormal turnout, well, 90% turnout in a country that is not named Australia, where they have, compulsory voting. Because even in Australia, where they have compulsory voting, only about 94% of the people vote. Not everyone votes, even though they're required by law to vote. So, like, if you have 90% turnout in a country that you're not required to vote for, that's too high. Um, you know, in things like holding back the vote, abnormal turnouts, all of those things are international flags that state departments, the UN, all look for before they legitimize an election. And if the UN was looking at our election, they would not legitimize our election. We do not pass any of our own standards. Yet, at the same time, 3 weeks after we had this election debacle, you have Mike Pompeo from the State Department condemning the Venezuelans' recent election for the same reasons that our election went to hell. You know,
Yep. I mean, it's shocking because to me, right, you have these, I was discussing this actually before, is you have these leaders, right, that are supposed to protect us, right, the American citizen, and you entrust in them that sacred duty, and you believe that they'll do it. And it seems like they're almost more concerned with condemning a country that they know they can't change the outcome in than condemning an election in a country they could, right? It seems like that burden to actually do something is what's getting in their way. That sort of impedance between them and actually taking substantial and concrete action. Because if you say, oh, well, Venezuela, we don't, we condemn what they're doing and they shouldn't be running their election in such a manner and this is corrupt. Well, at the end of the day, you're not going to actually do anything about it. You're just going to say something. Versus if they were to do that same thing about this election, many people would call for them to actually do something. For instance, Purdue stepped on stage in Georgia, and you know this, you saw this clip, and everyone starts yelling at him, fight for Trump, because telling them that you believe there was something wrong with the election, Trump supporters, it's not going to bode well for you because they want to see actual concrete actions and steps taken to ensure that there was transparency in the election.
yeah, I don't understand. Let's talk about Georgia for a minute. I don't understand why the Republican administration down in Georgia and the Republican senators won't make the recount and election integrity more of an issue in that election. them simply talking about, oh, Schumer's going to have the Senate, Schumer's going to change America, that isn't going to get the Trump voters out.
Absolutely.
You may be able to get the traditional Republicans who live in the suburbs and who have voted for the Bushes and the Reagans their whole life. But the people who are skeptical of the Republican administration, who don't typically vote, but they vote for Trump, the whole idea that, oh, we might lose the Senate, that doesn't resonate with them. They don't care about the Senate. They care about Donald Trump. Okay. And so that message isn't going to work. They need to, in order to win those Senate seats, they need to start making this election a referendum on election integrity. And not only will they not do that, David Perdue is about the biggest buffoon I've ever seen. I mean, he went on Newsmax and told Trump voters that they need to get over their hurt feelings.
I know to me, it almost seems like David Perdue sabotaging himself to purposely lose the election. It's quite mind blowing the strategy he's taking. And then you see an interview come out in which Perdue is talking about, working and to me, okay, right. I don't think that I think if there's no election transparency, that Republicans ought to not work 1 second with the Biden administration. They should contest absolutely every single action or step he takes, just like they did to Donald Trump for 4 years. They don't get a second of air they didn't give Trump. But with that being said, Purdue comes out, but with that being said, I think if it's somehow, which is not going to happen, this is my entire point, somehow in some crazy world, if it comes out that the election was completely transparent and yada, 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 and whatever, Joe Biden was fairly elected president. He wasn't, spoiler alert. I think that they should work with their administration. But the problem is that you see these people come out, like Purdue, come out and say, I'm excited to work with the Biden administration, essentially. It's like,
well, yeah.
Like,
the thing is that the Republicans are far more comfortable with a Joe Biden than they are a Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
It's much like the election of 1824, where the last thing they wanted was the insurgent Andrew Jackson. They don't want someone like that, so they're willing to rig the election. Now, the Republicans didn't rig the election, but what are they doing? They're standing by complicitly and letting it happen because they're okay with gaining 13 seats in the House. They're okay with holding the Senate and then giving the presidency to an illegitimate person. They're fine with that because in the end, if Donald Trump is gone, the money from the special interests start flowing again. They're just fine with it. They don't care. It's going to cost them politically. I don't think they realize that, or they probably don't care.
And I think what these Republicans don't realize is there's a bit of a two-front war that they have to constantly fight. And that, what I mean by that is they're fighting, not only are they going against obviously the left, but it's also internal special interests against outside forces. So on one hand, you have them going against the left and they have to try and appeal to the people on the right. But at the same time, they also have to fight against someone like Trump, right? And now more and more people that are outsiders that are saying, we don't want you to have these special interests anymore. We're tired of you taking money and not taking any concrete action. You see it over and over again. People, you know what? Like, for instance, I love Senator Hawley. He's great. My biggest pet peeve with him, if I were to choose one, is that he constantly says big things and doesn't follow through. And what I mean, and I'm just using this as an example to say that there are people that don't even come out and say really anything, period. And voters, especially now new Trump voters, are tired of it. They're tired of watching politicians go into office, say they're going to make substantial change, and then do what everyone else does, which is line their own pockets and then leave Washington wealthier than they came in.
Well, my theory about the politicians is that once you take money from the special interest, there's no way you can ever be loyal to your voter base. It's why Donald Trump was so successful. He didn't take money from the special interest, so he wasn't loyal to them. He was loyal to his voters. Hawley sounds great, but if he's taking money from that base, if he ever became president, he would turn on us. It doesn't matter. He's not going to fight the military-industrial complex. He's not going to fight any of those people because in the end he needs their money. It's just a bottom line. It's the way it works, and it's the way it's going to be. Unless you have someone like Donald Trump who can self-fund, or you have someone who has connections that can get the money without the strings attached, it's just not going to work out like Donald Trump worked out.
Correct. And I also don't think you get the same turnout in terms of voter base. I mean, you see Trump gaining in categories that no Republican president has since the 1960 election. And I think that's another critical point to make, another relative comparison, is that the diversity in class, in race, in sexual orientation, whatever category you want to name, Trump improved essentially besides white males, basically. Pretty much.
Actually, let me say about white males. Trump did not lose among white males. There's no indication that he lost among white males unless you're looking at exit polls. There's a lot of people pushing that. People like Ryan Gerdusky, who I can't stand. He's totally populisting. If I ever met him, I'd punch him. I don't like that guy. But no, Trump did not lose any support anywhere. You look at all the states, red states, not named Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia. He earned the same or higher level of vote share than he had in 2016. And the only reason the margin of victory was smaller was not because he lost white male support, but because there was a smaller presence of third party on the ticket. So, he didn't lose any support; he gained everywhere.
It's also important to note, by the way, if we speak about historical trends, going back to what you just said with third party votes, that no president, I think it's 11%, every time that the third party has lost its percentage in total vote, the incumbent has won the election. And again, it's another trend that somehow bucked every single historical example and didn't go Trump's way.
Right, exactly. There's every single historical non-polling average, every indicator pointed to Trump. Even there was even polling indicators like enthusiasm and strength of support, and all kinds of like the internal type polling that wasn't the head-to-head stuff that pointed to Trump. It somehow everything that had been right for decades was all wrong for the first time all at once. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, people talk about, it's a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm for Biden. This is beyond perfect storm, in my opinion, because as you said, a perfect storm would be some of the right factors on who showed up on election day. But even then, if you look at even the crappy exit polling didn't even indicate that. In fact, exit polling indicates that Trump had a fantastic day, better than they expected at the polls. So, go ahead.
You see, some of those exit polls indicated that he won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin pretty handily. They had all of those states with R plus turnout. Yeah. And another theory of mine is like, on election night, they were asking Arnie Michigan at Fox News, like, why can't you call this state? Why can't you call that state? And he would explain. And then Brett Baier would ask him, well, how are you determining how to call these states? And they would say, a combination of this and our voter analysis. Well, if you're using your voter analysis, then why haven't you called Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin yet? Because your voter analysis said Trump won those states handily.
Absolutely.
You see what I'm saying? Why weren't they calling them? Why weren't they calling them? Because if they were using the voter analysis, their voter analysis said to call those states pretty quickly for Trump.
100%. If you look at, for instance, the one that boggled my mind the most was Arizona, but also one that was just incredible to me was Alaska, which literally didn't call its vote for like a week plus on end. Nobody called it. It was so obvious.
That was stupid.
That there was no way.
He was going to win it. There's no reason they needed to wait to count that vote. They should have just called it.
Ridiculous. And in addition to Alaska, you look at North Carolina. Again, I think there was something like 100,000 ballots out there, and Trump was up like 90. It's like he would have needed to win like pretty much every single vote that was available, Biden to win, and they didn't call it. It just, to me, what didn't make sense was the statistical analysis that was used was seemingly different for each state, depending on how they wanted to work it, these outlets, when they were calling certain states.
On Wisconsin, I remember before the big fraudulent vote dump came in, Trump was up 4.1 points with 94% of the vote reported. And I thought to myself, there's no way he can lose Wisconsin, but something doesn't feel right. And I've tweeted this video out before, but at like 3:15 in the morning, I don't know if it's Central Time or Eastern Time, but I can tweet the video out again. Arnie Michigan is talking to Brett Baer, and they want to know why he can't call Wisconsin because the vote's almost all the way in. And Michigan says, well, we're waiting for this huge vote dump in Milwaukee.
I remember that.
Like we're waiting for this huge vote dump in Milwaukee. They told us it would be this, and now it's going to be about 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, when did that vote dump come? That was all for Biden. 4 a.m. It's like, so the media was colluding with the Democrats in these local areas.
Yeah, that's what was blowing my mind. I said, what didn't make any sense to me, I remember watching that clip and saying, wait a minute, how does the media know? Like, there's no way for them to know that in an hour from now, they're going to dump this many ballots to this many Trump, this ratio. There's no way. There's literally no way you can know that. I don't care what sources you have. The only source that you could have on the ground that would be able to tell you that is if you got a counter to be leaking information to you, in which case that is not, I don't know if it's illegal.
That's exactly what was happening. That's why they weren't calling the states, because they were communicating with the Democrat municipalities. And if they were telling them, no, we're still trying to find votes, then they were waiting to call. It's like, why didn't they? It was like, what, 80% of the vote was in Georgia, and Trump was up 5 points? Any other year, they would have called that for Trump.
That was another thing. If you look at voter turnout in certain counties, it just doesn't even make, you look at the graphs, right, of Georgia, for instance. You look at DeKalb, you look at Fulton, you look at Clayton, I think it might be. These counties, you look at them and you look at the turnout percentage. What doesn't make any sense is also, usually, even if it's a higher turnout election, you usually see net loss gain, one candidate loses, the other gains. What is so weird is that Trump gains 10, 15% in these areas, and then they're like, oh, Biden gained 80%. It's like, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, population growth does not account for the increase in vote in the Fulton and the DeKalb area. And another thing I would point to for the suburbs of Georgia, it moved 15 points towards Biden. Look at the other suburbs, the Orlando and Tampa suburbs and the Charlotte suburbs in North Carolina. They barely moved towards Biden. And you go to Dallas, Texas. Biden carried, and Dallas is like one of the biggest growing metropolitan areas. And
blue growing area.
Very liberal. It's very liberal, and the suburbs only went to Biden by 0.5 or a point, and the suburbs in Georgia moved 15 points towards Biden compared to 2016. Are you kidding me?
Ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense mathematically as well. If you look at, for instance, the voter swing for minorities, is that Trump won more minority vote, right? So you look at that. Someone was talking about it. I think it's in Georgia. They needed to swing the white vote, male vote, 30 or 40 points. It doesn't. What I don't understand is that none of the math seems to add up, right? If you look at it in that sense. And yet everyone says it's fine. Well, if you look at it from just a simple statistical standpoint, and I'm not even saying, here's the thing, is some people could make the argument, right, that the fraud wouldn't have changed the outcome. I want to just see it because I know it's there. That's my entire point. I just want to see it. And I know it's there. And I think that people are just so unwilling to show it, not because of being scared of changing the outcome, because they're scared of what it means to our country. Imagine what would happen if millions of citizens were told, it was unfolded, that the elections that they had been participating in for generations were not actually free and fair. I mean,
That's
anarchy would break out.
That's exactly what's happening. Right now, it's about protecting the institutions and the image of the institutions. The judges typically don't expose corruption, they protect institutions. And another point on statistics that I'll make is Biden drastically underperformed in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, three of the biggest, probably the most liberal cities in our country.
Absolutely.
And yet he overperformed in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia.
The only cities he had to do well in.
Exactly.
Doesn't make any sense.
If he's going to overperform in Philadelphia, he's going to kill it in New York City. That's just a fact.
Exactly. That was another point I was making throughout these past few weeks is in every major city. Obviously, you could look at minor cities. You can go into some random city and say, oh, well, look here. But I'm saying in the major, 5, 6, 7 cities that people think about when they think about the major metropolitan hubs of the United States, Biden underperformed in most of them. The only ones he did well in were the states where right now none of the numbers add up, which is Atlanta, Philadelphia, Milwaukee. I mean, it's like, for instance, like another stat that blows my mind about Atlanta, or fact about Atlanta, I shouldn't say stat, is that there is now video evidence of them pulling out suitcases for hours on end and putting ballots in with nobody there. And yet people are saying that it still makes sense that Biden killed it so well in that area. It's like, well, obviously he did. If you have suitcases of ballots no one's looking at.
But the video was very effective for the PR war. And these because people hear theft, fraud, they hear this, they hear that, they listen to you say it, but when they can see it on video, that's convincing. And so it doesn't matter who is. So if you're not like a hardcore Trump hater, you're going to see that video and you're going to be convinced of something. Maybe not full on stolen election, but you're going to be at least convinced of something. Okay, that's Absolutely. Just the bottom line.
And just speaking to more trends that we could talk about, in terms of historical trends, is Florida moving to the right. And every single time that has happened in the nation's history,
Pennsylvania and Michigan follow.
All move to the right. So they're trying again to make another claim that somehow, in some weird way, Florida moves to the right, and all the states up in the Rust Belt somehow move to the left for the first time in history. What I don't understand is, from the liberal point of view, is you present a bunch of these arguments, and liberals will say, well, those are like, it's correlation, not causation, and you can't definitively determine that anything fraudulent happened. It's like, yes, that is true right now. First of all, we don't have all the information, but more importantly is how much evidence do you need to get before it's the straw that breaks the camel's back? Because right now, if you ask me, there's a bowling ball on the camel's back with the amount of oddities that happened. It's not like, one weird thing. If it was any singular one of those trends that we've talked about, I would say, okay, it's weird, but we're talking 7, 8, 9, 10 trends all being bucked and all being the reverse of what should have happened, the opposite of what should have happened. To me, it doesn't make any sense. It's very
theoretically
bad.
Theoretically, as long as the media keeps covering it up, there is no amount of evidence that can ever prove fraud, because a complicit media does wonders for cover. That's just a fact. Because if the media was covering it, there'd be massive public pressure on the Democrats to do something about it. The Joe Biden campaign would be forced to participate in these legal lawsuits and these investigations to make it look like he's legitimate. But as long as the media is covering it up, they don't have to do anything. They can ignore it and delegitimize it. The problem that they do have, though, is that even these crappy polls, like Fox News came out today and said that 49% of Americans say that this election was stolen.
And that's a shitty left-leaning poll. You're absolutely correct.
Exactly. And the problem is that Fox News is usually underestimating Republicans by about 4 to 6 points. So you're probably looking at like 53% of Americans who believe that it was stolen.
It's incredible. And that's what I don't get either, is you would think that the Biden camp um, would want to make it as crystal clear as possible that they won the election, because to be honest with you, their strategy right now of not addressing it makes people way more skeptical and is far more indicative that something's awry. If they came out, honestly, and this is from my point of view, if they came out and said, you know what, we're so confident that no fraud happened, why don't you do a full audit of everything? I'd be like, you know what, if they're that willing to do a full audit, like probably Trump lost. But they're not. And they fought legally and in the media and in every avenue possible to cover as much up as possible. All of their tracks they've tried to make sure are undetectable, untraceable. And that's what's odd, right? Again, if you conduct yourself fairly, you'd want to show that everything was fair. You'd want to show the American people that there was an election that people can trust, but they don't even care enough to show it. That's how arrogant that to some extent the Democratic Party is, or not even the Democratic Party, the Biden camp is about this election.
Well, you're right. The behavior tells a lot about them. When Mark Elias runs down to Georgia to get into a lawsuit personally because now they're talking about suing over signatures, that's a cue that they're worried about signatures. They don't really care about the Dominion because they know Dominion isn't going to show anything.
By the way,
Let's be
Mark Elias, real quick before you continue, that guy, I cannot stand Mark Elias in terms of his legal viewpoints. He writes about victories about blocking auditing in audits in Wisconsin. He was one of the main pushers of the Russia hoax on the Steele dossier specifically. That guy it is shocking to me that people take anything he says seriously. He is so beyond, to me, he appears to be a very corrupt individual in terms of what his values are.
That's yeah, but listen to what you said. You said he pushed the Russia hoax. He sued over auditing. Those are all Democrat talking points. So half of the country is going to love him. That's just a fact.
Yes.
So it's all about worldview, and he reaffirms half the country's worldview. In terms of Dominion, let's be honest, Dominion is just not there. When they did a hand recount of Georgia, it affirmed that there was no problem with the machines. Okay, they would have found the problem if there were votes being switched. The hand recount would have discovered that it was a mess, with the machines. They didn't. The issue is the signatures, where they're ballot harvesting, the chain of custody, the not checking the signatures. That's the issue. That's where you're going to overturn the election. This whole Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood for a second. Did you see him down in Georgia dressed as Donald Trump?
I thought that was very interesting. He dressed with the red tie and the long coat and the hat and the gloves.
That guy is not well. I mean, I know there are a group of Trump supporters who love and hang on to everything he says, but I think his behavior is a little erratic. So
no, I understand that. Personally, here's my thing with him. I think Linwood is good for the movement in the sense that he's one of the only people sticking up for Trump. I think a lot of people have turned their backs and have sort of cowered and said, we're not going to actually do anything. My worry is that he starts to bring up things at times that are, as you said, a bit unhinged, and that actually detracts from the legitimacy of other arguments. Now, with that being said, I do like some of the things he does. I'm going to be honest, I do. I just, as you said, I think there are things he does at times that seem a bit over the top and detract from the way other people might view this election fraud as well. Also, just to touch on the Dominion machines for a moment, I have said for a while that they waited too long to do anything in terms of recounts. Whatever they had done with Dominion machines was wiped well before they did it. And I think what happened with a hand recount and why they're worrying about the signatures is two things, David. Is one, I think the big problem there is that they obviously had fraudulent ballots to begin with. And two, I think once the machines rigged whatever votes they were rigging and changed whatever votes they were changing, they did things either with the ballots, chain of custody, throwing out Trump ballots to make everything match, or and Biden ballots to match generally, or they just signed a bunch of ballots quickly post election and added them into piles because, as you said, there's no chain of custody. Nobody knows what actually happened with the ballots. I'm not trying to be some fringe conspiracist, but my viewpoint is that Dominion, if it really thought that they had done everything in a pure and clean way, they would have filed a defamation suit, come under subpoenas, talked about the election, said, we can show you. But they haven't. They haven't done anything. They literally have not taken a single step to prove themselves as innocent. That is, again, highly suspect. If your entire company is being defamed, you come out and you say, this is ridiculous. They haven't done anything. They've let it go. In fact, they hired lawyers on the defense, a defensive move that indicates to me they're worried. So I think that something went on there. And I agree with you, that's not where they would find the majority of the fraud. But I do think that something went on with the machines that allowed fraud to occur, if that makes any sense.
No, I get it. I just think Dominion might have another strategy of PR. Maybe they want to limit their public exposure. I mean, there are other legal strategies,
True.
PR strategies that wouldn't indicate nefarious things.
Yeah.
Everything is not always what meets the eye.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I just think, again, some people have talked about this. If Dominion was so clean, so pure, they would do some form of, they would take some action to vindicate themselves. The only thing that is, each day that they don't, each week that they don't, does make it seem a bit odd, especially when you look at their connections. For instance, they said we have no connection to Smartmatic. And then, they come out 2 weeks later and say, we were kidding. We have a small connection, but it's nothing significant. And it's like, well, why were you lying? Why did you lie about something as simple as if you had any connections to Smartmatic? There's no need to lie about that. Like, it's very easily identifiable. And it wouldn't make a big, if you came out and told the truth, no one would say anything. It's like, well, you lied and now you're coming out 2 weeks later after pressure. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. I wanted to also talk to you about what Rush Limbaugh said today. Did you see what he talked about today?
I missed it.
Okay, so Rush today discussed secession by certain states, depending on what goes on here with the election lawsuit. In your opinion, do you see a repeat of any type of secession based on the way states are acting? And if not, how do states feel that they were cheated go about some form of redress or some form of resolution? Because obviously states' constituents are upset and it seems like the divide is getting worse.
The divide isn't any worse than it was in 1860. We've always been a divided country. There will be no succession. This war will be fought at the ballot boxes. We will in 2022. The best thing to do is to win back legislative chambers and governorships so you can reform election laws, and then to win back board of governors seats so you're counting the votes and not Democrats, and then to win back county sheriffs seats so you're enforcing the law and not Democrats who are enforcing the law. Because in Philadelphia, one of the things that happened was when the Trump campaign got a court order to have access to the counting room, the county sheriff's department refused to allow access despite a court order.
Yep,
That's an elected official. That's an elected official, so we need to focus on winning those back too. So not only counting votes but enforcing the law. So that's how this battle is won, through the ballot box. But local office, I could care less about the House of Representatives. I prefer to keep the Senate. House of Representatives, I don't care about. Not right now. The local office is how you change the laws, and it'll be led by Donald Trump. The best way to do it is to have him run around, campaign for populist candidates and populist reforms. He will bring out the most people, and it'll help him too because he can he can build the infrastructure he'll need to actually have institutional support when he runs again in 2024.
Uh-huh.
So
And just
that's the way I see it.
and just to touch on one other quick thing, by the way, it's a side note. I loved what you said there. I really agree with basically all of it. That a lot of this change needs to happen through the ballot box, but also it has to happen through a populist movement because that will win more seats in the House, eventually in Congress and the presidency. But just to touch on the House of Representatives for a moment, I think Trump again this is another trend where Trump might be, I think, the first incumbent, maybe one of just a couple, for his party to have gained seats in the House and he to have lost his presidency. So another very bizarre point. I don't know if you know anything about that, but that was another interesting fact I saw about in terms of historical context of elections.
I have never gotten around to checking down ballot race effects. I know Larry Schweikert mentioned that there have been a couple elections where the top of the ticket lost and the down ballot races did fine, and vice versa too. But I personally have not laid eyes on that research and never got around to it. But I'll take Larry's word for it. So.
Yeah, but it's very rare is the point, I believe. And another thing that's just quite odd that wouldn't make much sense. But it was especially because of the number of House seats that were gained in addition to Congress. It is odd. Another severe oddity. But we'll moving on here to sort of wrap up the podcast here. 2024, let's say Trump doesn't run. What candidates are you looking to or for to run, and who do you think will be successful for the presidential ticket for the Republican Party?
The only one I can see right now to be successful remotely is Ron DeSantis. But even then, I'm concerned about how Ron DeSantis is perceived, not how his policies are and how people on Twitter perceive him, but how he's perceived in the upper Midwest of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Is he perceived as a populist conservative, a Trump type person, or is he perceived as a conservative? Because a conservative is a dirty word up there. It's like a corporatist stooge type person. They don't like those types of people. Conservative means different things in different places. And if he's perceived like a George Bush, which I think is possible, then he may not be successful. And I fear that someone other than a Donald Trump may be perceived as a George Bush up
there. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that there is that I would say that to me, if I were to look at who's running at the top of the ticket, it would be DeSantis possibly. And again, as we were discussing, maybe he just doesn't get by in the Midwest. I think he can be okay, but we'll see. I also see someone like Trump Jr. coming out, Donald Trump Jr. I think that he would be very popular. I don't think Eric should run, but Donald Trump Jr. might run, so we'll see with that as well.
I agree. Eric Trump is not a politician.
No, he's Don a great guy. Jr. I like Eric, but he's not. Don Jr. is the politician.
Don Jr. is the politician, and Larry Trump is the politician too.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll see them, I'm sure, in the future. Well, David, this was a great talk. And where can people find more of your work at? I know you're publishing a book soon, or hopefully in the near future. What's your social media, just so people know where they can find more of your information?
My Twitter is David Chapman 141.
Awesome. So people can follow there. Again, it's David Chapman 141. They will be coming out with a book soon, not on politics, but on sports, an equally interesting topic and an equally passionate topic to talk about. David, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really do appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.